The two events happened almost at the same time. One was the announcement that in just a few short weeks we will have a new minister. And the other was an ABC program, Backroads, about the little town of Cygnet. Cygnet's about nearly 60k southwest of Hobart, has a population of about 5,000, and it's occupied now by groups of people who are artists, musicians, academics. You probably can be both, academics, and so on. And the ABC program talked to some of the people in that little town. And it was fascinating when they were questioned, how many of them said, well, we don't really like the changes. I wonder whether that means that they have to cancel the famous Cygnet Cup, which is a race between snails. Who knows? Let me give you two dates and see whether you can link them. 6th of August, 1944, 11th of September, 2011. Two world-changing days, actually. The first was the day that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and the third was the planes driving into the World Trade Center. And so what I'm saying this morning is that because in just a few weeks there will be a new minister in this church, we face the possibility of change. Not much we can do to stop it, and certainly we won't be the first to face it. Legend is that when Adam and Eve were being expelled from the Garden of Eden, Adam said to Eve, well, my dear, we live in a time of transition. But of course, in our day, we have seen so much change. You probably won't see a protest in Melbourne where they say, what do we want? Gradual change. When do we want it? Oh, when you're ready for it. That's not the way we operate, is it? And I thought I'd sit down and just make a note of some of the changes I've seen. If you buy a computer tomorrow, it'll be out of date by the time you leave the shop. And the same with cameras and stereos and phones and golf clubs. So just for an exercise, when you go home today, write down some of the changes you've seen in your lifetime. Some little more than interesting, others world-shattering. For example, looking around, not one of you. When I went to church, all the ladies wore hats. And I sometimes wonder, who was the first woman to decide, I'm not going to wear a hat to church this morning? And you've all followed suit. Probably, like my father, men had their Sunday best. My dad had a suit that he wore to funerals and weddings and church. What did you call the minister? You certain wouldn't have called him John. There'd have been at least a Mr. in front of there somewhere. and he would have been a he, no ladies there, and the Bible reading would have been from the King James Version, and you wouldn't have been praying for the Catholics. No, we don't do that. So there have been these incredible changes. Fascinating, isn't it? We accept change in so many things, but I wonder, are we reluctant to accept change when it comes to our church? And so when the Reverend Sylvia comes, you can guarantee that there will be changes. There's a wonderful book in the Bible called Job, a man who went through amazing changes, lost everything. And the friends come along and they say to him, "Curse God and die." And Job's response, "Even though he slay me, yet will I trust him." So the point of that Old Testament reading was that I see it as a kind of a parable. In situations in life, we have three possibilities. Let's go back to what we used to do. You know, I can remember we have an American evangelist came out to Sydney to preach, and the first couple of services, he was a bit too modern. And he got the message, and so the last sermon that he preached in Sydney was on, "Give me the old-time religion, it's good enough for me." It was good enough for my father and my mother and my sister and my brother, and it's good enough for me. That's one thing we can do. Let's go back to what we used to do. Let's leave the choir where they are. We don't want them up the back anymore. Or else we can say, let's stay and do what we're doing now. We won't offend anyone, and we'll just exist, and eventually we'll die out of existence. Or, and this is the main point, we can say, let's try something we've never tried before. You know, it's such a lovely story, those men, those lepers. Go back to the city, we'll die. Stay where we are, we'll die. Try something different, we still may die, but we'll be no worse off. There is the need for us to change as our journey changes. Jesus spoke about, I have not come to bring peace, but division, disturbance, change. Now, if you go to any self-help section of any bookshop or library, you will find a book about the personal goal of a well-adjusted personality. But that doesn't mean we should settle down content with the status quo. There is a Christian place for maladjustment. As Paul put it, don't let the world squeeze you into its mould. We cannot be content where there is injustice, inequality, prejudice, bitter sectarianism. But in order to cope with change, we need to have our eyes on the unchanging. There's a hymn in the old Methodist hymn book that says, change marches on, May all change be blessed. And the hymn that we used to sing at funerals, change and decay in all things around I see. You never change, O Lord, abide with me. And Isaiah says, though the mountains move and the hills shake, my love shall be immovable and never fail. There's a lovely story about the family where the breadwinner had been relocated to Sydney. And that night before they moved, they heard the little boy as he knelt down at his bed to say his prayers, "Goodbye, God, we're moving to Sydney." I can understand that. Every church has to avoid the temptation of becoming tied to the past, to a particular personality, to a particular way of doing things. And the hymn put it so well, didn't it? The Lord has yet more light and truth to break forth from his word, to follow the truth wherever it may lead. David Reed is a Presbyterian minister in New York, and he has a sermon called Is God Over 30? Fascinating title. And we laugh at the question and say, well, God is ageless. But if we do that, we may give the impression that God is old. For to be ageless is to be eternally young. There's probably only one date that I can remember from history, and that is 444 BC. It was when Ezra moved back to rebuild the temple. Just as an aside, it's an interesting story to read because there were enemies who didn't want to rebuild the temple, and they put up certain ways of stopping the building, and the one that I like best is, this is the way to stop a building. Let's form a committee. But in the story of the opening of the new temple, there were the cheers from the people who were so glad to see it, but there was the weeping of so many who were saying, it's not as good as it used to be. That's the problem, isn't it? And so is God over 30? God is calling us to the choice of being part of what used to be or being part of what is to come. I read a book on worship written by an English Baptist, and it was about worship, and in it he has this frustrating thing where he quotes, puts it in inverted commas, but there's no footnote, there's nothing in the index to say where it came from. And so you might like to ponder over its meaning during this week. It was this: God is on the side of that which is coming into being. God is on the side of that which is coming into being. With our lives centred on God, we can face change. We can welcome it. We can use it creatively to celebrate a God who is marching on. Amen.